So go ahead and get started. And thank you for joining us today for this special presentation from Jonathan Birch. Let me do a quick introduction, and then we can have everything in Jonathan's hands from there. So Jonathan is associate professor of philosophy at the London School of Economics, where he's been for the past decade. He's also the principal investigator on the Foundations of Animal Sentience project, which obviously is connected with the talk's topic today. And I think importantly, in 2021, he led a review of the evidence of sentience in cephalopod, mollusks, and decapod crustaceans that led to invertebrate animals, including octopuses, crabs, and lobsters, being included in the UK government's Animal Welfare Sentience Act 2022. Probably upset a number of restaurateurs, but that's a different matter, probably for a different talk. And in setting up his talk, I thought it was really interesting because while I was traveling, I was reading Peter Godfrey Smith's recent book, Metazoa, and I think this might actually be a nice statement of part of the problem that will be addressed today. In one of the mid-chapters, Peter says, one person will look at a paramecium and say it has feelings. Another will not just dismiss the paramecium, but also fish. So I think with that, I turn things over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Alan. So do people normally stand in this room? Or
totally up to you.
Sit there?
It's totally up to you.
It's a real borderline case. I think if I stand, I'd be towering over you a little bit much. So I'll try sitting and see how that goes. But yeah, thanks for fitting this talk in. It's really nice to be here and to see the place, and it'd just be nice to visit for longer, ideally. Sadly, I'm just passing through very quickly. It's obviously a very significant place in the history of philosophy of science. I was very excited to see some of Herbert Feigl's books sitting around on the shelf in the other room. I think that Feigl has been quite a big influence on my work, particularly his work on the mind-body problem, where he has this idea that the mind-body problem is really three different problems: a problem of sentience, a problem of sapience, and a problem of selfhood. And that in human beings, all three of these things are packaged together. We're sentient, sapient, and we have selves. But that in other animals, these things may well come apart, and that it could well be, for example, that the sentient world is much larger than the sapient world, much larger again than the world of selves. So, I mean, sentience, certainly as Feigl sets things up, is about raw feels. It's about qualities. It's about there being something it's like, as Thomas Nagel put it, to be you, the sort of raw subjective experience. And I've long found it very plausible that might well be there in a much wider range of animals than we often think. That's certainly been one of the motivations for my Foundations of Animal Sentience project over the past few years, which I'll introduce briefly before zooming in on a specific argument. So, I mean, the background to my project is, well, there's now a huge science of human consciousness. A lot of work on other primates and mostly monkeys and humans in that area of research, but a strong sense that perhaps it's time to branch out a bit and try to study consciousness in a wider range of animals than just humans and other primates. In 2012, there was this declaration from a bunch of leading neuroscientists, including Christoph Koch, where they got together in Cambridge and they declared that non-human animals, including all mammals and birds and many other creatures, including octopuses, possess neurological substrates complex enough to support conscious experiences, whereby conscious experiences they meant raw feels, experiences that feel like something from the animal's point of view, what philosophers will often now call phenomenal consciousness. I mean, 11 years later, I think a field really is emerging, a field that is very strongly interdisciplinary and that blends contributions from comparative psychology, neuroscience, animal welfare science, because the welfare implications are so significant, law, behavioral science, evolutionary biology, and my own discipline of philosophy. It's a field that faces foundational challenges, which is where my project comes in. By the way, if you want to bring up any of these slides on your own screen or bring them up after after they've gone by. If you go to bit.ly/Birch Minneapolis, bring up these slides in a browser window. So the project's been going since 2020 and it's funded by an ERC grant from the European Union. It's been a real pleasure because I've been able to assemble a team to work on these issues, including, well, 3 postdocs now, and we're recruiting 2 more as well. And I've got 3 PhD students currently. So it's developing to be a real team. And our goals are to develop better methods for studying the conscious experiences of animals scientifically, and also new ways of using the science to design better policies, laws, and ways of caring for animals. The work we've been doing is of various different kinds. There's been some pretty clearly conceptual work, for example, this paper in Trends in Cognitive Sciences, where we were addressing the question, does it make any sense to describe some animals as being more conscious than others? Is there any kind of single scale on which we can sort animals and say, mammals are more conscious than birds, and birds are more conscious than octopuses? And we argue against that idea. I think that there really is no such single dimension. What you have instead is many, many different dimensions on which the conscious states of different animals might vary. And so this paper constructs a sort of organizing framework for thinking about some of the most important dimensions of variation. And then we try to draw some tentative inferences about what current evidence might tell us about the consciousness profiles of different species. We say we should be thinking of variation in terms of consciousness profiles, not single scale. There's also been more empirical work where we've been looking at cases where there's really ongoing dispute about whether the animal is feeling anything or not, with significant ethical implications because people disagree about pain, for example. And a good case of this is bees. People genuinely disagree about whether there's anything pain-like in bees. And so there's a branch of the project that is based at Queen Mary in London in a bee lab, Lars Chitka's bee cognition lab, trying to develop experimental approaches for gathering relevant evidence on the question of whether bees can feel pain. And then there's also, as Alan mentioned, this policy-facing side to the project as well, where we're trying to put the science to work to help policymakers design better animal welfare policies. That's been more successful than I ever thought it would be, really, because it ended up lining up in quite a favorable way with a good opportunity, because the UK left the European Union, which is on the whole a bad thing, but it meant a lot of laws had to be rewritten, essentially. And in particular, it meant we left the Lisbon Treaty, which has a line in it about respecting animals as sentient beings. And so the government came under a lot of pressure from animal welfare organizations who were saying, well, you don't respect animals as sentient beings anymore, or are you going to introduce new legislation that will recreate this commitment? And they agreed to introduce a new act, the Animal Welfare Sentience Act, that would create a committee overseeing a duty imposed on policymakers to respect animals as sentient beings and consider the animal welfare consequences of their actions. But then they produced a draft of this bill which only included vertebrates, leading to quite a bit of criticism from people saying, well, why aren't you including at least some invertebrates, like octopuses, for example? And so they commissioned a team led by me to review all of the evidence concerning cephalopod mollusks, including octopuses, and decapod crustaceans, including crabs. And we reviewed all of the relevant evidence we could find. We developed a framework for synthesizing that evidence, reviewed over 300 studies, and ended up recommending that these animals should be included in the scope of the new legislation. And the government implemented that recommendation, which was, you don't always get that. Like when you produce a big policy report like this, you don't always get a response, but we did in this case. Admittedly, there were a lot of other recommendations in the report as well, which haven't been acted. So for us, this should be the beginning of the story, the beginning of actually changing the whole body of UK animal welfare law to try and provide some protections to animals like crabs and lobsters. And there's still a long way to go with that, but a first step has been achieved. So we've been doing a lot of different stuff. There's also this kind of field building side to the project as well, which is more to do with, remember that diagram of all those different disciplines. There's the potential for quite a lot of friction when you're trying to bring people together from so many different disciplines. Part of the project is about this, getting people together around common questions. So I've been doing these sort of editorials where I ask people a question and tell them to respond in 500 words or fewer. There's this one in General Consciousness Studies called How Should We Study Animal Consciousness Scientifically? And then one that Joe Ledoux helped me with in Current Biology called Consciousness Beyond the Human Case. So a lot of stuff, but in the talk, I want to zoom in on a kind of skeptical threat to all of this stuff. It's part of a kind of loose trilogy of papers where I'm responding to people who just think there can't be a science of animal sentience for one reason or another. One of whom is Peter Carruthers, who I've written about in the past. Another one is Marianne Stamp Dawkins, who I've written about in the past. But the main critic I'm going to zoom in on in this talk is Lisa Feldman Barrett, which we'll come to later. But basically, I'm thinking about a skeptical threat that says, could there be reasons to think that other animals don't actually have emotion? So even if they're conscious in some sense, even if they have the raw fields of some kind, perhaps they experience colors, sound, could there be reasons to think that they don't have any emotion? Now, a common reaction to this is, that's crazy. I mean, that's wildly implausible. If you interacted with a pet dog or a pet cat, it seems unbelievable to suggest that other animals could entirely lack emotions. And I think that's basically what I think. But, I mean, one can't just leave it there. The reason being that there are an important class of theories, so-called constructionist theories, that are now quite prominent in emotion science, in the human case. And that on the face of it seem to imply that emotions are probably a uniquely human phenomenon. Lisa Feldman Barrett being a very prominent advocate of those views. So it seems a more considered response to the skeptical threat is needed, and that's what I want to do in this talk. Zoom in on these theories, explain why they seem to be bad news for emotions in animals, and then suggest ways out. So I think, by way of background to this, it's important to have in mind the contrast between two big pictures of emotion, what it is, how it relates to the brain, what I'm going to call the basic emotions view, and the constructionist alternative. So the basic emotions view is very favorable to ascriptions of emotion to animals. And it's associated with Paul Ekman, Panksepp, more recently Mark Soames in this quite accessible book, The Hidden Spring, A Journey to the Source of Consciousness, where the basic idea is that basic emotions are neurobiological natural kinds. They are joints in nature, as philosophers like to say. The precise nature of these basic emotions varies a bit from one author to the next. But if you take Panksepp, for example, who I take as my focal example, he says there are 7 core kinds of emotional experience. He ended up, his views changed a bit about what they were, and his mature view is that they are seeking, fear, rage, care, lust, panic, and play. And he thinks for all of these core kinds of emotional experience, there are distinctive mechanisms in the brain that generate them. He also thought these mechanisms were evolutionarily quite ancient. In fact, he thought they were tied to a region at the top of the brainstem called the midbrain, and with a particular area called the periaqueductal gray being especially important. Here's one of the diagrams from his book. This is, if you think that the cortex, now the cortex is this bit here. He's saying, the mechanisms responsible for these basic emotions, very, very deep in the brain, in the midbrain. These sorts of regions over here. This is based on the brain of a rat, I think. So in humans, the cortex is enormously enlarged. It's this huge crinkly outer layer that is really all you see when you look at the brain from the outside. So on Panksepp's view, we're talking about circuitry that is very ancient and that is universal to at least all mammals, and maybe even a much wider range of animals than that. And each basic emotion has characteristic behavioral expression. A crucial part of his research involved stimulating these regions in rats and other mammals, and showing, well, if I stimulate it here, it produces a fear response. Stimulate it like this, produces a sort of, one of the other four emotional kinds, like a rage response. And in Panksepp's view, these basic emotions require no readout by a higher cognitive apparatus. So it's irrelevant that the cortex in rats is not gigantic like it is in humans. Basic mechanisms are not located there. You can have emotions without them. And a key part of the view is that these circuits are substantially conserved right across the mammals. So, for example, the circuits that drive play behavior in human children are substantially the same as the circuits that drive play behavior in rats. So when you see rats going into play mode and playing versions of hide and seek, as they do sometimes in games like that, or wolves playing, or any animal displaying play behavior, Panksepp's view is there's common circuitry that puts them into that mode. Now, this can be contrasted with the other major picture, the constructionist alternative, versions of which we find in at least Feldman Barrett's work. This book, Emotions Are Made. Also, Joe Ledoux has a similar view, and James A. Russell basically rejects all of that. All of those key claims of the basic emotions view. This view sets itself up in opposition. Where the constructionist view, the constructionism comes from psychological constructionism, rather than in philosophy we talk about social constructionism, and it's not quite that. But it's this idea that emotional experiences are in a sense constructed through the application of concepts to incoming sensory signals. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to predict and categorize certain kind of interoceptive signals from the body. And to do that, we have various emotion concepts. And that, for example, an experience of fear involves having a concept fear to which you apply to your current state and the internal context. I've got these internal symptoms, and there's a bear chasing me, fear, and we apply the concept of fear. The implication of this view, at least in the Barrett version, that if there's no concept, there's no emotion. So in disagreement with Panksepp, Barrett thinks the processes that do this in humans are cortical, mainly prefrontal cortex at the front of the brain, and moreover that the concepts and the corresponding emotional experiences are highly susceptible to cultural and linguistic influence, and that this is the core of why emotion words seem to vary so much from one culture to the next. And that, moreover, people vary in their level of classificatory skill, or what Barrett calls emotional granularity. So she has it, there's some people who really struggle to categorize their internal states at very fine grain, who they can tell you if they're feeling bad or feeling good. They can tell you if they're feeling tired or energized, but they really struggle with subtle discriminations. So yeah, they will struggle with things more subtle than that. If you say, in what way are you feeling bad? Are you sort of like sad, depressed, anxious, what's going on? They'll just say, I don't know. And Barrett contrasts that with people who are, in her phrase, emotional sommeliers, that they have very fine-grained classificatory skills and will be able to tell you exactly, this morning I was feeling more anxious, but now I'm feeling more depressed. There's a little bit of fear mixed in there. They will give you much more fine-grained descriptions. I think it's an important part of this view that the phenomenology changes, just as it would for a skilled perfumer or a skilled sommelier. They experience something different when they smell the perfume or taste the wine, because they've developed this attentional skill to attending to all the different elements. In a similar way, Barrett thinks people with a high level of emotional granularity will experience different emotions. than those who have much coarser grain. And so in contrast to the joints in nature on the basic emotions view, on this view, its philosophical opposite, the cookie cutter metaphor, often gets used. The idea is we have this dough of just interoceptive signals coming up from the body, plus external context. And we have our concepts that allow us to classify it at various coarser or finer grains. And that dough can be carved up in lots of different ways. And the emotions we feel depend on the concepts we have. So the concepts of these cookie cutters. It's kind of a troubling thing, I think, that two such radically different pictures of what emotions are coexist, and there seems to be no easy way to tell which is right or what kind of intermediate position might be right. The debate has proven very persistent. I think it's worth thinking a little bit about why it's proven so persistent, that you might think that cross-cultural variation in emotion would settle the issue in favor of constructionism. So you read, for example, about these words they have in Japan, the feeling that you're going to fall in love with someone when you first see them, things like that. That concept of, is it hugger in Danish? Different emotion concepts all around the world. Might think that's good news for constructionism, but of course the basic emotion theorists fight back there and say that what we're trying to describe is the building blocks from which more complex emotions are made. So you might think complex emotions are composites of various different basic emotions. You might think that there's something like guilt or something like that, that this involves a certain amount of sort of sadness and anger directed at one's past actions or something like that. So basic emotion theorists try to make sense of complex emotions in terms of basic emotions, and then the ways in which the building blocks are combined can of course vary across culture. And moreover, they have display rules. So ways in which you learn to either express or inhibit the expression of your upwelling basic emotions. There might be certain contexts where you really suppress hard because it would be really inappropriate to just burst into tears in this context. Another context in which you express, and those can vary cross-culturally as well. So they've got tricks up their sleeve to explain cross-cultural variation. And then you get the same thing with universals, that you might think cross-cultural universals would really strongly tilt the balance towards the basic emotions view. The fact, for example, that certain emotions like anger and fear, I mean, there's no culture you can go to in the world where these would be totally alien notions. What fear? What's fear? No idea what you're talking about. But constructionists have tricks up their sleeve to explain that cross-cultural convergence, because if you think of emotions as being about developing concepts that are the cookie cutters we apply to the dough of signals from our body, they're concepts we design in response to certain challenges our social and natural environment presents. And similar challenges may lead to convergence on similar concepts. And they might say, for example, that it could really be very useful in any culture anywhere in the world to have a concept for something like a negatively valenced, unpleasant, high arousal state that's elicited by a threat and motivates escape. No big surprise that cultures across the world have converged on it being useful to have a concept for that kind of thing. And that's what we translate as being the concept of fear. So the debate seems to be very persistent and it's not going away. I don't think it's been settled in favor of the constructionist view, so I don't want it to sound like I'm actually endorsing the constructionist view, but I think it's worth thinking about the conditional. If it's true, then what? What follows from it if it is right? Could be true, so it's important to consider its implications. In particular, does it have two implications that would be rather troubling for me as director of the Foundations of Animal Sentience project? Does it imply that emotions are uniquely human? And also, does it undermine arguments for the moral significance of other animals? Actually, I think the answers are no to both. I think it neither implies that emotions are uniquely human nor undermines significance for the arguments for the moral significance of other animals. So I will talk about why I think the answer to the first question is no, and then see how I'm doing for time, but then hopefully also explain why I think the answer to the second question is no as well. And so, I don't think constructionism needs to be something we necessarily fear being true. So for purposes of the rest of the talk, I'm going to zoom in on Lisa Feldman Barrett's version of constructionism, which I think is on the face of it the most hostile to emotions in other animals of the three I discussed when I mentioned Russell, Ledoux, and Barrett. It appears to imply that animals lack emotions for the following reasons. That, in an earlier version of the talk, I said the view makes emotion language dependent. And Lisa Feldman Barrett got very annoyed about this. Like, my view is not that emotions are necessarily language dependent. They just end up contingently language dependent because they involve abstract concepts. And I think abstract concepts can only be acquired through language. So that's the way she would put it. That on her view, these emotion concepts, these cookie cutters, are quite abstract. They're abstract in the sense that the instances of an emotion concept lack any common sensory grounding. So if we think about concepts like red or blue, they're not abstract because there is a common sensory grounding. There's certain receptors in the retina that are being stimulated, and our concepts, there's some flexibility, but there's also they're quite constrained by what receptors we actually have. I don't think emotion concepts are very much not like that. There are not sort of, emotion taste buds, like a sort of fear taste bud or a anger taste bud. Rather, what you have is this immensely complex mess of external context and signals from your body, and huge flexibility in how this dough can be carved up. And in the end, what we end up with are concepts that are abstract, in that if you think of something like fear, well, there's many, many different contexts that can cue it, everything from a bear to a job application, and there's many different ways the body can be when in the presence of such a trigger, and there's many, many different expressions as well, everything from running away to a startle response to just refreshing your email with a growing sense of dread. And so you can see what she's talking about here, that there really is quite an abstract quality to all these things that we put together under the heading fear. And that's the source of the problem for emotions in other animals, because in our own case, concepts that are abstract typically acquired through language. If you think of paradigm cases like money, really, really hard to teach anyone the concept of money without language. It's rather by being linguistic creatures that we're able to point to all these things and say that piece of paper, that coin, that number on the screen, these are all money. And so it is with a concept like fear, Feldman Barrett, that through language we're able to group together otherwise disparate sets of reactions that have a certain kind of social salience and that we find it convenient and useful to group together. And we know of no other way in which abstract concepts like these can be reliably acquired. And other animals, even other great apes, seem to struggle to acquire abstract concepts. I say struggle because it'd be too strong to say it's completely impossible. There are cases, for example, of macaque monkeys in tourist resorts like Bali, where they've got very clever about they'll grab someone's phone and you offer them food in response to get the phone back, and they won't give it to you unless you give them two, because they know a phone is a very high value object. And so they've developed this sort of concept of barter almost. They go for the high value items, and they know their worth, and they will not accept. They will not hand them back over without rewards of sufficient value. And so there's been experiments with great apes exchanging tokens for various rewards. And so there's some ability here to grasp a concept of a token or the value of an item through extensive interaction with humans. But I think it is fair to say other animals struggle with abstract concepts because there's, in cases where we find a plausible example, there's quite a long history of interaction with humans. It seems to have been required to get them to that point. I don't think it's very plausible that we find animals in the wild away from humans interacting in a way that suggests grasp of abstract concepts like money or barter or anything like that. So if all of this is right, we seem to have an argument for why we should think emotions are uniquely human, because they require these abstract concepts that we get through language and that can't be easily got any other way. Interestingly, Barrett herself recoils from that conclusion and does not. Now, there's one way she could go with this, which is just to say, I don't think other animals have emotions, deal with it. And that's not actually the line she takes in the book or in her writing on this. There's an article in The Guardian she wrote in 2022 that explains how she does think of these things. She ends up with quite a weird view on which emotions end up being sort of interpreter relative. She says emotions that you see and hear in others are also human creations. When you experience another animal as fearful, you're not detecting fear in any objective sense. It's a construction in your brain. Your brain groups different movements, sounds, and other physical signals together into the same category to give them emotional meaning. If a fly beneath a looming fly swatter rubs its legs together, it freezes on another occasion. Human brain can generalize across both cases, but a fly brain's equipped to go beyond physical features. How about the brain of a cat or a dog? The answer is probably no. Some animal brains, such as those of chimps, can categorize abstractly, but that's to our knowledge only we have the wiring to compute abstractions of this magnitude. A non-human animal's fearful state is real for human observers, but not necessarily for the creature itself. I think this is not a way we should go with this. It's to avoid skepticism, Barrett switches to a kind of relativism where, yes, your dog can be afraid, but it's afraid relative to your point of view, as where you are the interpreter of the dog's expressions and movement. Only humans, it seems on her view, have emotions relative to their own first person point of view. Emotions in other animals are relative to the points of view of human observers. Other animals lack the relevant interpretative skills. I don't think this is a good way out of the apparent implication of the theory. It's, I mean, what to say about it? Well, it avoids the implication that animals are completely emotionless, but does so at the cost of embracing an implausible relativism about emotion. Why is it implausible to say that emotions are relative to some observer? It's implausible, I think, because if we think about our own emotions, experiences of emotion, it's quite clear that they don't constitutively depend on how others interpret our emotion. If I'm afraid, that doesn't constitutively depend on the fact that you watching my facial expressions are interpreting that as an instance of fear. There is at most causal feedback. How you react might causally influence how I feel, but it's not a constitutive relationship. So, I mean, you could say there's this huge gulf between humans and other animals, whereby humans have experiences of emotion that don't constitutively depend on any external observer, but your dog does. Your dog does have experiences that depend constitutively on how you interpret the dog. But I think that's a really unattractive view in that it involves positing a mysterious metaphysical chasm between humans and other animals. So I don't think Barrett's own view is very promising. To avoid relativism, I think a constructionist like Barrett should just say the emotions experienced by an animal depend constitutively on its own conceptualizations. External observers are not determining the facts here, even if they do causally influence what the animal feels. But then it's hard to escape the implication that if the relevant concepts really are absent, as Barrett insists, other animals just don't have any emotional experiences. So I don't think she succeeds in avoiding that apparent implication of her own view. So there's a sense in which that, you know, Barrett's view really is quite a bleak one, and that it, at face value, really, I think, implies that other animals don't have any emotions because they lack the relevant concept. Is there a better way to reconcile Barrett's theory of constructed emotions with emotions in other animals? I think there is. That's the next part of the talk. I think there is. It's a version that involves moving away from the idea that these concepts are abstract ones. I think we can contrast two versions of a constructionist view of emotion. I'm going to call them grounded and abstract versions. Where the abstract one is Barrett's one, and it's really hardline in that it says there's no neurobiological or behavioral signature that instances of fear have in common. As with money, there's only the cultural/linguistic fact that they all fall under the word fear and have an associated constellation of normative expectations within our shared interpretative practices. I think that's Barrett's view. But that can be contrasted with another way of being a constructionist that says you still need the concepts, but the concepts may be grounded in certain ways. That the processes through which emotional experiences are constructed begin with recognizing genuine neurobiological/behavioral similarities between instances of fear. It's just that, and here I think perhaps an analogy with odor is quite helpful, olfaction, smelling. But it may just be that there are many relevant similarities the process can build from. I think this is actually suggested by the emotional sommelier concept that I mentioned earlier, that if you think of olfaction, it's not that there's no objective similarity at all between the stimuli you're experiencing. It's not as though the different wines that you classify in a particular way objectively have nothing in common at all. There will be some chemical similarity that you're picking up on when you group them together. It's just that there are really many different ways in which you could do that. There are many different objective similarities you could latch onto. In philosophy of science, we've long had this contrast between a real cookie-cutter constructionism of the Nelson Goodman sort of type and what John Dupre calls promiscuous realism, where the difference is that for promiscuous realists like Dupre, it's not that there are no objective similarities at all that we're picking up on when we come up with natural kind concepts. Papers were initially about species. It's not that there's no objective similarities at all between instances of a species like tiger. It's rather that there's many different similarity relations we could pick up on and build from. So, I mean, I don't know how to turn this into a baking metaphor, but I mean, it's not that it's pure dough and you can cut it up any way you like. It's just that it often seems that way because there are many objective joints you could pick out. I think that the same may be true of emotions. I think it's very plausible for the case of olfaction. And I think emotion may work quite a lot like olfaction, maybe a sort of the smell of the body from the inside, as it were. That it could be that there are genuine objective similarities. These are what we build from. But there's a huge amount of variation across cultures because there's a huge amount of different similarities we might choose to build from. So what would favor the abstract view over the grounded view? I mean, I think Barrett's main motivation is what she sees as the failure to find from the outside any characteristic signatures of basic emotions that could provide a concrete sensory grounding for our emotion concept. She thinks there's a contrast with cases like color and odor, where we can quite easily point to the signatures. We can actually define what the chemical is that makes something smell like vanilla. We can actually point to the wavelengths that you detect as red. The search for signatures doesn't have to go very far in those cases. She thinks, in contrast, in the emotion case, decades of looking for objective signatures through neuroimaging, through surveys, all these different techniques, videoing people, looking at their facial expressions. She thinks it's systematically failed to find characteristic signatures. And that's the main motivation. I think in defense of the grounded view, we can say that, well, what we're attempting to do here is extremely difficult because we're talking about signals that are coming up from the body. They're not coming from the external world in the first place. They're not like wavelength or chemical compound at the nose. These are signals from inside the body. It's intrinsically a very difficult business to use something like neuroimaging to find what the objective similarities are that instances of fear or anger, for example, actually have in common. Especially if Panksepp is right to think that brainstem areas are very important here, because our ability to image those areas is still, to be fair, very difficult and very limited compared to our ability to image the cortex, which is right on the outside. I think the failure to find clear signatures of different emotions from the outside does not show that there are no such signatures discernible from the inside. Does not show that, if emotion were like smell and we were able to get right in to the point at which this signal reached the brain, so there wouldn't be anything there to find. It doesn't show that an animal's own self-monitoring mechanisms are not readily registering genuine neurobiological similarities between instances of fear, rage, and so on, that are just hard to see from the outside. Moreover, it's okay if the signals are disjunctive. Here, I think the case of color is a relevant analogy because there are many different ways many different wavelengths of which an object may be reflecting, which causes you to see it as a certain color. The experience of yellow, for example, can be generated by light of particular wavelength associated with yellow light, or it can be generated by a mixture of green and blue light, isn't it, mixed together. You also see as yellow, and you cannot tell the difference. So totally different wavelength profiles can give rise to the same experience of color. So sometimes these objective similarities are there, but they're very disjunctive. And that's fine. That might be true of emotions as well, but that's fine. It doesn't mean there are no objective similarities there. And I think if there are such signatures, even if they're quite disjunctive, even if they're very hard to spot from the outside, it would then be no surprise to find that many animals are able to acquire the relevant categorization skills, just as they do with colors and odors. Think of dogs, for example, they're extremely skilled classifiers of olfactory stimuli. If emotion does work in a similar way to olfaction, if it's a kind of smell of the body from the inside, there's no reason to think they wouldn't be very good at categorizing their internal states as well. I think the grounded constructionist view retains the main attractions of Barrett's abstract version. Well, at least to me, at least seems more plausible and avoids the consequence that animals are completely emotionless, which I think is a plus as well. So that's think of those two questions. Does constructionism about emotion imply other animals have no emotions? Yes, if we take the abstract path, but no, if we take the grounded path, and I think the grounded path is more plausible. So that's my answer to that question. And then I'll just, in the last part of the talk, I'll go back to that second question I asked, which is what are the ethical implications if constructionism is true? Now, if the grounded version is true, it's quite clear that I think a very wide range of animals will still have emotions. But you might think, what if the abstract version is true? What if the Lisa Feldman Barrett version is true? What would be the ethical consequences of that? I think there's a troubling thought here, which is that, well, if Barrett is right, and if emotions did turn out to be uniquely human, wouldn't that be a total disaster for animal ethics? Wouldn't it turn out to be a really ill-founded feel. I think that would be a bit hasty to infer that. So I think the states that are of the greatest ethical significance in animals are not necessarily emotions to begin with. But it's important here to distinguish emotion from a somewhat broader category of affect. I think we should do that. And when we do that, we see that it's really this broader category that is the source of the ethical significance, rather than emotion as such, I think. So affect versus emotion then. I mean, this distinction is actually a point of agreement across basic emotions people like Panksepp and Barrett, and I think it's a good idea as well. In that affect is really a much broader phenomenon, I think, than emotion. It's any state with valence, any state that it has a pleasant or unpleasant aspect, and arousal, so any state that involves feeling more or less energized. But that's a broader category than just the emotions like fear, anger, joy, etc. There's also just states like, well, pain, for example. It might be a bit of a stretch to call that an emotion, but nonetheless, it very clearly has an affective aspect. It feels extremely unpleasant. I think a lot of bodily sensations, hunger, thirst, and not emotions as such, because they're tied to the body in such a strong way, to a specific need, that we tend not to describe them as emotions, but they do have a very strong affective side. Hunger, thirst, they feel very bad. I think a constructionist, even of the abstract type like Barrett, can still allow that experiences of affect can occur without any interpretation, and maybe very widespread in the animal kingdom. So it could still be that you need concepts to have in particular emotion, but general states of things feeling unpleasant or pleasant or more or less energizing, that could be something that could occur without any interpretation at all. That from the outside, we might say animals might feel more energized or lethargic or better or worse. They don't have the concepts to those concepts themselves, but the thought is they don't need to. And so it seems compatible with the core commitments of constructionism to hypothesize that effective experiences with no associated emotion require very little cognitive apparatus. That there might be this experience of raw cookie dough, as it were, uncategorized affect, uncarved, just the raw stuff. I think it's incredibly hard for us to imagine such experiences, because when we imagine having an emotional experience, we're using our own conceptual apparatus to do that. So if we imagine we try to imagine what it's like to be a deer being chased by a wolf or something like that, we will invoke our own concept of fear, and so we'll imagine being afraid. We won't imagine raw, uninterpreted affect. I think we really struggle to do that. But the fact that we struggle to imagine that isn't a good argument against its existence. This is the point of Nagel's paper on the bats and echolocating. The fact that we can't echolocate means we really struggle to imagine what it's like to echolocate. But it doesn't mean there is nothing it's like to echolocate. It's just an imaginative limitation. And we should probably say that too about the experience of uncategorized affect. And then, I mean, it's worth thinking a bit about what would be the ethical significance of completely uncategorized, uninterpreted affect. What sometimes gets called core affect in this literature, just the raw cookie dough. Which makes me think of the Ben and Jerry's cookie dough ice cream. Right? You don't always have to have a fully baked cookie. Sometimes just the cookie dough can be nice, and we're entertaining a possibility a bit like that here. Maybe other animals just have the raw cookie dough, but it's still a kind of effective experience. Would it matter ethically? I think the answer is clearly yes. It clearly would be a source of ethical concern, these raw experiences with valence and arousal. And I think that's where a lot of major positions in animal ethics actually lead. I've written reviews recently of Christine Korsgaard's book and Martha Nussbaum's book, but I'll just zoom in on the case of classical utilitarianism. If you're Bentham, for example, you think the question is not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? And it's reasonably clear, I think, that what Bentham is getting at there when he talks about suffering is not an emotion in which you apply the category, the concept suffering to your current state, but rather just any experience with negative valence at all, and anything feels bad to be in. And the point is, well, if an animal has that, if an animal is capable of being in a state that feels bad to be in, that counts morally. And it doesn't matter whether it is an instance of a specific emotion. It doesn't matter whether it's fear or any other negative state, anxiety, depression, whatever. The particular category does not matter. It already counts ethically just from being negatively valent. And then you might say, well, should these raw valenced experiences nonetheless matter less? And maybe we should have special concern for particular emotions. I think that's, I don't really believe that. I think what is true is that it's very useful if we find that other animals can be interpreted using human emotion categories. If we can identify states like fear, stress, panic, rage, lust, and so on. In animals, this is a very useful thing because it's going to allow us to respond appropriately, design appropriate animal welfare interventions. The sort of interventions that make sense when an animal is stressed are not necessarily the same as the ones that make sense when it's afraid, and so on. So the more we can get out of our own emotion concepts in interpreting the states of animals, the more useful that will be for designing animal welfare interventions. But I think it would be a mistake to read a conclusion about ethical importance out of that, and to say that, well, if they don't feel the emotions we do, their states are less ethically important. I don't think that's right at all. I think a particular valenced experience doesn't merit greater moral weight by virtue of falling under a human emotion concept, or indeed any emotion concept. I think the raw valenced experience, if it feels as bad as particular human emotion, deserves the same moral consideration. The fact that it doesn't fall under a concept should change that. I suppose a third concern you might have is, well, these raw valenced experiences be in some sense less intense or less rich than constructed emotions. And again, I think the answer is, well, not necessarily. I mean, there's no reason to think they'll be less intense. There's no reason to think that by bringing one of these states under a concept, we increase its intensity. There is a sense in which they might be, a constructed emotion might be richer. So I think one sense of the word richness in this context is to do with categorization power. If you think back to that idea of granularity, there is a sense in which the emotional sommelier has a richer experience than the emotional novice, just like the wine sommelier has a richer experience in a sense than the novice. That sense there is one of categorization power or granularity. They're able to resolve more elements of the experience. But then I'm not convinced that's the sense of richness that actually matters for ethics. It's certainly not the only sense. There's at least two other senses. There's a sense that is to do with bandwidth. What's the amount of content that you're experiencing at any given moment? And there's no particular reason to think that bandwidth comes with these conceptual skills. There's also acuity, which is distinct from categorization because it's about ability to notice differences. There's research on olfaction, for example, let's go back to the smell analogy, that humans are actually really, really good at noticing a small difference in an odor, even without extensive training. So you can get sort of novices, and you get them smelling a particular perfume, and then you change it slightly. Very good at saying, oh, that's different now. And that's what I mean by acuity. You can be very good at that, even though you don't have the labels, you don't have the categories. But if someone asks you, well, all right, you notice the difference. Now tell me what was in the two perfumes. They might then say, I have absolutely no idea. Because that's the skill that takes years of training, the ability to apply those labels. Let's go back to a case of emotions. It could well be that animals are experiencing very fine-grained changes in core affect. Things are feeling better or worse by small increments, feeling more energized, more lethargic by small increments, even if they entirely lack the ability to put names, categories, labels on the states. So there's many different senses of the word rich. I mean, at least those three, and only one in which having emotion concepts gives you richer emotion, richer affective experiences. I think I see no reason on the face of it for that particular metric of richness to dominate the comparison when we ask how rich are this animal's affective experience. So for all of those reasons, led to the view that those, even if Barrett's right, I don't think she is right, but even if she's right, and theory of constructed emotion in its abstract version is correct, I don't think that would lead to the implication that the affective experiences of animals don't matter ethically. And I don't think it would lead to the view that they matter, but matter less by any means. They would still continue to matter, even if they're very raw, uncategorized cookie dough. So that's why my answer is no to both of those questions. I don't think it's actually plausible that other animals lack emotions, but even if they did, I wouldn't find it plausible that their affective states would lack ethical significance. Okay, so that's my response to that skeptical threat. And if you want to read more about what we've been doing on the project, there's a link to our website. And if you want to bring up these slides, including any of the links in them, go to bit.ly/Birch Minneapolis. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks, Tom.